She thought pulling that fire alarm would get her in trouble. She never imagined it would stop a kidnapping and save a millionaire's life. Riley Harper pushed open the heavy glass door of the Grant Tower, the cold air from outside still clinging to her hoodie. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and the coffee from the cafe across the street. Her sneakers squeaked on the shining floor as she clutched the brown paper bag holding her mother's lunch. She had made the bus ride downtown like she had 100 times before, weaving through business people in suits who barely looked at her. Most days, she walked straight to the service elevator that took her to the basement where her mother kept her cleaning supplies. Today, she stopped. Two men stood near the main bank of elevators, both in tailored suits that didn't quite fit the mood of the busy lobby. They weren't talking, not even pretending to check their phones. They were watching. Not the front desk, not the floor directory, but the elevator doors themselves. Their eyes tracked every person who stepped in or out, quick glances that slid away whenever someone met their gaze. Riley had learned to notice people like that. In her neighborhood, knowing who was paying too much attention could keep you out of trouble. She slowed her pace, pretending to dig in the lunch bag for something, and studied them from the corner of her eye. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his tie perfectly straight, his hair cut close to his scalp. The other was thinner, with a face that looked like it could be friendly, but wasn't. They didn't speak to each other, but every now and then, one would give the smallest nod, and the other's gaze would follow a particular person until the elevator doors closed. She felt a flicker of unease, but she couldn't say why. People waited for elevators all the time. But these men weren't waiting to go anywhere, she was sure of it. They had that stillness about them, the kind that meant they had a reason to stay exactly where they were. Riley's stomach tightened. She thought about telling the security guard at the front desk, but he was leaning back in his chair, chatting with the receptionist, not even looking in their direction. Her mother was expecting her, and the bag was still warm in her hands. She took a breath and started toward the service hallway, keeping her head down. As she passed the elevators, the taller man's gaze flicked to her. It was quick, but sharp, and Riley knew she'd been noticed. She looked away instantly, willing her feet to keep moving. By the time she reached the hallway, her heart was beating faster than it should have been. She told herself she was imagining things, that they were probably just waiting for a friend or a client. Still, she glanced back once before disappearing around the corner. They hadn't moved. The elevator doors opened and closed, spilling out streams of people, but the two men stayed right where they were, watching, waiting. Riley didn't know it yet, but they weren't there for just anyone. They were there for one man only. And before the day was over, she was going to find out why. The glass walls of the penthouse conference room framed the city like a photograph, the winter light pale and cold over the skyline. Alexander Grant sat at the head of the long table, his fingers pressed together, his expression unreadable as the voices around him rose and fell. He was 34, young for the level of wealth and power he held, but the last few months had carved sharp lines into his face. Across from him, his CFO, Martin Hale, was tapping a pen against a folder. His tone clipped as he recited numbers that sounded more like losses than projections. At the far end of the table, Lila Carson, the company's lead engineer, sat forward in her chair, her laptop open, her eyes tight with frustration. They were supposed to be discussing final preparations for the launch of Sentinel, the AI security platform Alexander had spent the last 2 years developing. Instead, the conversation kept circling back to the leaks. 3 in the last 6 weeks, each one hitting them harder than the last. Early code stolen, proprietary algorithms appearing in the hands of competitors, and most damaging of all, rumors spreading in the industry that Sentinel wasn't as secure as they claimed. It had already cost them millions in potential contracts, and had put their biggest investors on edge. Alexander listened, without interrupting, but his mind was already moving faster than the arguments around the table. Every leak meant someone inside his circle was feeding information out, and if he didn't stop it now, the launch could collapse before it even happened. The timing was critical. Sentinel wasn't just another product. It was the cornerstone of a much bigger expansion, one that could put his company at the top of the global security market. If they failed, competitors would rush to fill the gap, and everything he had built could be undone. Martin was pushing for a delay, arguing that they couldn't risk going public with so many questions about security. Lila was pushing back hard, insisting the core system was solid, that the leaks weren't about flaws, but about theft. Alexander let them talk, his gaze fixed on the black surface of the table, seeing in his mind the network diagrams, the secure servers, the encrypted files he had designed himself. He knew Lila was right. Sentinel wasn't broken. Someone was breaking it from the outside, with help from the inside. When the argument reached another dead end, Alexander lifted his head. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made both of them fall silent. They would move forward with the launch date as planned. They would double internal security, limit access to core files, and audit every communication leaving the building. And, he added, they would find the leak, not in a month, not in a week, but now. He didn't care what it took or whose name ended up on the report. The air in the room tightened, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Lila nodded, closing her laptop with a quiet snap. Martin looked less certain, but he didn't argue. Outside, the city stretched on, unaware of the storm gathering in the penthouse. Riley stepped out of the service hallway and into the main lobby again, balancing the lunch bag in one hand while brushing hair from her face with the other. She was heading for the side corridor that led to the maintenance room where her mother kept her cart, but movement by the elevators caught her eye. The doors slid open with their usual polished chime, and for a brief second she saw him, Alexander Grant. She had seen his face plenty of times before, though never in person. It had been on news articles her mother scrolled through, in the business section of the morning paper she sometimes brought home, even on the screens in the electronics store near the bus stop. He was the kind of person who seemed to exist on a different planet from hers, a world of clean suits and glass offices and headlines about millions of dollars. Seeing him here, close enough that she could make out the faint lines around his eyes, was like suddenly spotting a movie star walking past you on the street. He was talking to a man in a dark suit, not the two she had noticed earlier, but his tone was low and focused. He didn't see her, not with the way his attention stayed locked on whatever point he was making. Still, something in the air shifted in that moment. The two men from the lobby, the ones who hadn't moved in 10 minutes, looked up together as the doors opened. Their eyes landed on Alexander, sharp and watchful. It wasn't admiration or even curiosity. Riley had seen looks like that before, though in different settings. It was the way some older kids in her neighborhood watched a delivery truck, or the way a stray dog fixed on a moving target. The elevator doors lingered open for just a heartbeat longer than usual. In that space of time, the taller man glanced at his partner, then at the elevator panel above the doors. The numbers glowed in quiet sequence. The shorter man's mouth moved, only slightly, like he'd said something without sound. Then the doors slid shut, cutting off the view, and the lobby returned to its usual rhythm of footsteps and murmured conversations. Riley stood where she was for a moment longer, the lunch bag warm against her palm. She didn't know what any of it meant, but the exchange stuck with her like a splinter she couldn't pull free. She told herself it was none of her business. Her mother always said that was the safest way to get through the world. Keep your head down, mind your own life. But as she walked toward the back hall, she found herself glancing over her shoulder. The two men hadn't moved again, their attention still fixed on the elevator. Whatever they were waiting for, she felt certain it had everything to do with the man she had just seen, and for reasons she couldn't explain. The thought made her uneasy. The staff room was quiet, except for the low hum of the vending machine and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Riley sat on a plastic chair near the door, swinging one leg while she waited for her mother to finish mopping the upper hallway. The brown paper lunch bag was open now, the sandwich gone, the smell of her mom's cooking still lingering in the air. She was used to waiting here, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes longer, depending on which floors her mom had to cover. Usually, she would scroll on her phone or sketch in the small notebook she kept in her backpack. But today her mind kept drifting back to the two men in suits and the way they had looked at the elevator. She shifted in her chair, restless. The hallway outside was empty, the muted carpet swallowing the sound of her sneakers as she wandered out. She moved toward the end of the corridor, where the executive elevator shaft was hidden behind sleek metal doors. The air here was cooler, quieter, as if the building itself knew this area was off-limits to most people. That was when she noticed it. Faint at first, just enough to make her pause. A smell, sharp and metallic, like the sting of a sparking cord or the inside of a burnt-out toaster. Riley followed the scent to a small maintenance closet she had passed 100 times before. The door was closed, but not locked, the narrow strip of light at the bottom glowing pale yellow. She hesitated, glancing both ways down the hall. No one was there. Her curiosity edged past her caution, and she wrapped her fingers around the cool metal handle, pulling the door open just enough to peer inside. The closet was cramped and cluttered with shelves of cleaning supplies, coils of cable, and boxes labeled with faded black marker. At first, nothing seemed unusual, until her eyes landed on the far corner near the baseboard. A small device, no bigger than a paperback, sat on top of a coiled extension cord. It wasn't like any tool she had seen before. Smooth black casing, a single blinking red light that pulsed in steady intervals, the faintest whisper of heat radiating from it. The smell was stronger here, that burnt wire tang mixed with something chemical. Riley crouched, careful not to touch it, watching the blink of the light. She didn't know much about electronics, but she knew this didn't belong with mops and dustpans. The wires from the device trailed upward, disappearing into the back wall, and she realized it was connected to something beyond the closet. Her pulse quickened. She thought about going to find her mom right away, but another part of her hesitated. If this was important, telling the wrong person could make it vanish before anyone else saw it. She pulled her phone from her pocket and snapped 2 quick pictures, the red light flashing in the second one. Then she closed the door slowly, the click of the latch sounding louder than it should. The smell still clung to her clothes as she walked back to the staff room, but now there was something else too, a prickling awareness that whatever she had just seen was not supposed to be there. Riley sat back down in the plastic chair, but her legs wouldn't stop bouncing. The image of the small black device kept flashing in her mind. The slow blink of its red light, the faint smell of burning wires. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. Maybe some part of the building's systems, a sensor or alarm component she didn't understand. But the thought didn't settle. She had spent enough time in this building, waiting for her mom to know what belonged and what didn't. She had never seen anything like that before. Her first thought was to find her mom. Her mom would know what to do, but she was working somewhere on the upper floors, maybe cleaning a conference room, maybe halfway through mopping a long hallway. By the time Riley reached her, the device might be gone, or worse, might do whatever it was designed to do. She glanced at the hallway again. It was empty now, too quiet. The low murmur of voices from the lobby had faded, replaced by the distant hum of the elevators. She thought about going to security. There was a guard stationed near the front desk, a big man with a permanent frown who never seemed all that interested in the people who weren't dressed in suits. The idea of trying to explain to him why she had been snooping in a maintenance closet made her stomach knot. She could already picture his face, the way he'd lean back and tell her she must have been mistaken. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. Barely 10 minutes had passed since she'd left the lobby, but the men in suits were no longer there. She didn't know when they had gone, only that they had been standing in the same place for so long and now they were gone, without a trace. That unsettled her even more. Her gut told her the device was wrong, not just out of place, but dangerous in some way she couldn't name. She imagined it connected to the elevators, to the doors, to the lights, maybe even to the cameras that lined the building's hallways. She imagined it as a switch, ready to be flipped, and she didn't like thinking about what might happen when it was. Riley chewed at the inside of her cheek. She could ignore it. She could sit here, give her mom the rest of her lunch, and go home without saying a word. But she knew herself well enough to know the thought would follow her home, would sit with her through dinner, would make her wake up in the middle of the night, wondering if she could have stopped something bad from happening. Her hand went to her phone, her thumb brushing the pictures she had taken. The red light was caught mid-blink in one of them, like it was winking at her. She took a deep breath and stood. Her heart was beating fast, but her decision was made. She wasn't going to ignore it. Riley's footsteps felt heavier the closer she got to the end of the hall. The maintenance closet was just around the corner, hidden behind its plain white door. The blinking red light burned into her mind. She had gone over her choices 100 times in the past few minutes, each one feeling wrong. She didn't know how to disable the thing, and she didn't know how long it had been there. All she knew was that it shouldn't be there at all. The empty hallway made every sound louder. The hum of the overhead lights, the faint whir of the elevators, and her own quick breathing. Her eyes landed on the bright red fire alarm pull station mounted on the wall beside the stairwell. She froze. She'd passed it countless times, always told not to touch it unless there was an emergency. That was the rule. Pulling it without cause meant trouble. Maybe a fine. Maybe police. Maybe her mom losing her job. But as she stood there, she thought about the strange device, about the missing men from the lobby, about the way her gut kept twisting tighter with each passing second. She didn't think. She moved. Her palm smacked against the metal handle, yanking it down until it locked into place with a sharp, final click. The reaction was instant. A piercing siren exploded through the quiet hallway, bouncing off the walls and rattling through her chest. Red strobes began to flash along the ceiling, their lights slicing the air into jagged bursts. Somewhere above, the automated voice of the building's alarm system cut in, repeating instructions for immediate evacuation. Riley jumped back from the alarm as if it had burned her. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was it. She had just turned the entire building upside down, and she didn't even know if the threat was real. Within seconds, doors up and down the hallway opened. Employees poured out, some startled, some annoyed, all moving toward the stairs. A few clutched phones to their ears, talking quickly as they joined the stream of bodies. Riley was swept up in the movement, pressed between strangers who didn't know she was the reason for all of this. The noise was overwhelming. The sirens, the echo of hurried footsteps, the voices shouting directions. She kept her head down, gripping the strap of her backpack like it was the only solid thing in the chaos. Part of her wanted to run, to vanish before anyone realized she was involved. Another part of her wanted to turn back, to see if the device was still there, to know if it was doing something now. By the time she reached the lobby, the place was a blur of flashing lights and moving people. Security guards directed the crowd toward the exits, their radios crackling with clipped voices. Riley glanced toward the main elevators and saw they were frozen, their doors locked open. She told herself she might have just caused a huge scene over nothing. But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed that. The sharp wail of the fire alarm cut through the penthouse conference room like a blade. For a split second, everyone at the table froze. Their conversation about launch schedules and risk reports left hanging in the air. Alexander Grant's eyes narrowed, his mind instantly moving through possibilities. A false alarm was inconvenient. A real emergency could be catastrophic, especially this close to launch. Before he could ask a question, the door burst open, and 2 members of his private security team stepped inside. "Sir, we need to move now," the taller one said, already scanning the corners of the room. Alexander didn't argue. Years of running a company under constant threat had taught him that hesitation wasted time. He stood, collecting nothing from the table, and followed them out into the hallway. The alarm blared in his ears, the flashing lights throwing harsh red and white across the walls. He expected they would head toward the main elevators, but the guards pushed him in the opposite direction, toward a discreet door that blended into the paneling. "This way," one said, holding the door open to reveal a narrow service stairwell. The air in here smelled faintly of paint and metal, the kind of place most employees never saw. The door shut behind them, muting the alarm only slightly. The 3 of them began their descent, their footsteps quick and purposeful, on the concrete steps. "Any word on what's happening?" Alexander asked as they rounded the first landing. "Not yet," the shorter guard replied, his voice low but urgent. "But the alarm triggered a lockdown on certain systems. Whoever planned this isn't going to get you through the usual exits." Alexander caught that choice of words. Whoever planned this, but didn't press for details. If his security team thought this was more than a drill or a random incident, he trusted their instincts. What he didn't know was that downstairs, the 2 suited men who had been loitering in the lobby all morning had been waiting for precisely this moment. Their plan had been to catch him after the meeting, as he left through the public elevators, and walk him directly into a waiting black sedan. Everything would look normal to anyone watching, just an executive being picked up by a car service. But it wouldn't have been his car service. Now, as the crowd evacuated, their carefully timed window was closing. They scanned the stream of employees heading toward the street, searching for his face, for the sharp cut of his suit, for any sign that their target had been separated from his handlers. He wasn't there. They exchanged a brief glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Meanwhile, Alexander reached the service level, where another guard waited beside a nondescript metal door. Outside, in a narrow back alley shielded from the main street, a company SUV idled, engine running. He climbed in without hesitation, the door shutting behind him as the vehicle pulled away. The alarm still screamed through the building, but for Alexander, the real danger had passed without him ever knowing how close it had come. The lobby was a storm of movement and noise, the wail of the alarms bouncing off the marble walls and echoing in Riley's chest. People spilled from every hallway and elevator, their voices overlapping in a jumble of questions and hurried instructions. Security guards waved them toward the glass doors, their radios crackling with clipped orders. Riley kept her head down and her steps steady, slipping into the current of bodies heading for the street. Outside, the cold air hit her face, sharp and biting after the stuffy heat of the building. The sidewalk was crowded with employees clustering in small groups, some pulling out phones, others hugging their coats tighter against the wind. Riley moved toward the edge of the crowd, her eyes scanning without her really meaning to. That was when she saw them. The 2 suited men from earlier were no longer by the elevators. They stood near the far corner of the lobby now, just inside the glass doors, each with a phone pressed to his ear. Their gazes swept over the sea of people like searchlights, sharp and focused, never lingering on any one face for too long. They didn't look worried like the rest of the crowd. They looked frustrated. Riley slowed her pace, careful not to draw attention. The men weren't just looking around at random. They were hunting for someone. Someone they expected to see in the chaos, but hadn't found yet. She thought about the moment the elevator doors had opened, and she had seen Alexander Grant. She thought about how their eyes had locked on him instantly, and how their focus had sharpened like they'd been waiting for that exact sight. Now their expressions told a different story. Whatever they had planned had been interrupted, and they were trying to figure out where their target had gone. One of them turned slightly, speaking into his phone with a clipped tone, while the other's gaze swept the street outside, as if expecting to see someone step out into the open. Riley followed his line of sight, but there was no sign of the man from the elevator. She stayed close to a group of office workers, chatting about how inconvenient the alarm was, nodding at their complaints while keeping her attention on the suited men. Every so often, they exchanged glances, brief but tense, like they were silently agreeing on their next move. The taller one pocketed his phone and disappeared back into the building, while the other lingered, scanning the crowd one last time before following. The flow of people was beginning to slow, the first wave of evacuees already starting to check their watches and talk about when they'd be allowed back in. Riley felt the weight of what she had just seen settle in her stomach. She didn't know what the men had been planning, but she knew the alarm had stopped them from carrying it out, and she knew, without question, that they had been looking for Alexander Grant. The alarm still echoed faintly in the stairwell when the building engineer pushed open the door to the maintenance closet. He had followed the trail of a faint electrical smell, sharp and acrid, that didn't match any normal system in the tower. His tool belt clinked as he crouched, a small flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The blinking red light caught his attention immediately. It pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate, on a sleek black device wedged between a coil of cables and the metal housing of the fire suppression controls. He frowned, leaning closer without touching it. The wires weren't part of the building's standard setup. Whoever had installed it had done so quickly but precisely, wrapping the connections in a way that blended them into the existing network of lines. It would have been easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, easy to assume it belonged there. But he knew every inch of this building's systems, and this did not belong. He pulled out his radio, his voice low but urgent, as he called for the head of security to meet him. "I've got something," he said, his eyes fixed on the steady blink, "and you're going to want to see it." Within minutes, 2 security officers arrived, their expressions shifting as soon as the flashlight beam landed on the device. The engineer explained what he'd found, pointing out the extra wiring and the small transmitter tucked against the wall. One of the officers stepped back to make a call, speaking in quick, clipped sentences. The other stayed close, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "This is a remote access unit," the engineer said finally, recognizing the shape of the housing and the ports along one side. "It's not just wired into the fire system. It's tapped into the elevator controls and the camera network." The words landed heavily in the small space. He traced the wires with a gloved hand, careful not to disturb them. The setup was clever in its simplicity. If the alarm was triggered, this device would send a separate signal to the elevators, locking certain floors entirely. At the same time, it would cut power to select security cameras, leaving blind spots exactly where someone might need them. The fire system itself would keep functioning, so no one would suspect sabotage until it was too late. The head of security arrived, his face tightening as the engineer explained again. He didn't need to ask what this could mean. He could already picture how easily such a setup could be used to trap someone or move through the building unseen. He ordered photos taken from every angle, the device left in place for now but closely monitored. Somewhere in the crowd outside, Riley stood among strangers, unaware that the thing she had seen and feared had just been found. The sirens were still fading into the distance, but inside the building, the reality of what had almost happened was only beginning to settle. The service stairwell opened into a dim corridor that smelled faintly of oil and cold air. Alexander's security team moved quickly, one man ahead of him and one close behind, their pace brisk but steady. The muffled sound of the fire alarm still bled through the walls, a constant reminder that something had interrupted the meeting upstairs. They took a sharp turn and pushed through a heavy metal door that led into the back loading dock, the sudden rush of icy wind hitting Alexander in the face. A black SUV idled near the far end of the dock, its exhaust curling white into the air. The driver's door opened, and another security officer stepped out, scanning the area before giving a short nod. Alexander climbed into the back seat, his mind already working through possibilities. He hated being pulled from a meeting without explanation, but his security detail knew better than to overreact without cause. If they had decided to move him, there had to be a reason. The head of security slid in beside him, shutting the door as the SUV pulled away from the dock. The streets here were narrow and quiet, far from the glass front of the main lobby. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "It wasn't a drill," the security chief said finally. His voice was low but certain. "We found a device wired into the building's systems. If that fire alarm hadn't gone off, it would have locked the upper floors and disabled our cameras in key locations. You'd have been isolated before anyone could respond." Alexander absorbed the words, his expression tightening. And the alarm wasn't part of their plan? No. Whoever set this up counted on things looking normal until it was too late. The alarm forced an evacuation before they could trigger the lockdown. He leaned back in his seat, the city sliding past the tinted windows, and considered how close he might have come to being trapped in that conference room. In the wrong hands, a controlled lockdown was as good as a cage. Someone could have walked him out under the pretense of an escort, and no one would have questioned it until long after he was gone. "Any idea who pulled the alarm?" he asked. The security chief shook his head. "Not yet. We're checking cameras, but the system was already being tampered with. We'll find out." Alexander stared ahead, his thoughts moving faster than the SUV. Somewhere in that building, someone had acted without hesitation, forcing a full-scale evacuation and breaking whatever chain of events had been set in motion against him. Whether it was instinct, luck, or both, that choice had bought him his freedom. As they merged into heavier traffic, the security chief's phone buzzed with updates, but Alexander let his gaze drift to the skyline instead. He didn't know who had pulled that lever, but he knew one thing with certainty. Their split-second decision had just saved his life, and he intended to find out why. The alarm had stopped, but the tension in the air still clung to the Grant Tower like static. Employees stood in small clusters on the sidewalk, talking in low voices, the smell of cold exhaust mixing with the faint trace of burnt wiring that had drifted from the building earlier. Uniformed police officers moved through the crowd with clipboards and notepads, their questions clipped and direct. Who had seen something unusual? Who had been near the fire alarms? Who had noticed anyone acting out of place before the evacuation began? Inside the lobby, more officers spoke to building management and security. The head of security stood with his arms folded, giving a brief statement to a detective who scribbled notes without looking up. A few feet away, the building engineer explained about the device, his voice carrying just enough for Riley to catch words like wired in and intentional. The meaning was clear enough to her. This hadn't been an accident. Riley kept her position near the edge of the crowd, her backpack strap pulled tight against her shoulder. Every time an officer's eyes swept in her direction, she shifted slightly, making sure there was someone else between them. Her stomach felt heavy, as if the truth of what she'd done was a weight she was carrying just under her ribs. She knew she could step forward and tell them. She could explain about the smell of burning wires, about opening the closet door, about the strange device with its blinking red light. She could say that she had been the one to pull the fire alarm. Maybe they would thank her. Maybe they would understand that she had done it because something in her gut had screamed that it was wrong. But another voice in her head reminded her of the other possibilities. They might be angry that she had touched the alarm at all. They might accuse her of wasting resources, or worse, suspect her of being involved. She thought of her mother, still inside somewhere with the cleaning staff, and how she could lose her job if people thought Riley had caused trouble. An officer in a dark coat began making his way toward her side of the crowd, stopping to question each person in turn. Riley's heart thumped harder. She turned her face slightly away, pretending to study the row of parked cars along the curb. When the officer stepped closer, she eased back through the group of people behind her, moving carefully so it didn't look like she was trying to escape. Within a minute, she had slipped down the sidewalk, the sound of the conversations and sirens fading behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the corner, where the flow of traffic masked the noise from the building. Her pulse was still racing. She wasn't sure if she had done the right thing, but she knew one thing for certain: if she hadn't acted, something far worse might have happened. For now, that would have to be enough. The conference room on the 12th floor had been turned into a temporary command center. Its long glass table now crowded with laptops, cables, and half-empty coffee cups. Alexander stood near the far end, arms crossed, as his head of cybersecurity, Devin Ross, leaned over a screen filled with lines of code and network diagrams. The low hum of conversation from the team blended with the soft tapping of keys, each person focused on a different piece of the puzzle. They had been working without pause since the device had been found, tracing its origin through every scrap of data it had managed to transmit before the alarm cut its operation short. The blinking unit itself sat in a sealed evidence bag on the table, its red light finely dark. "It's not off the shelf," Devin said, pointing to a cluster of components on his laptop screen. "Custom built, with code specifically written to interface with this building's fire suppression and elevator systems. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were targeting." Alexander's gaze didn't waver, meaning someone with inside knowledge. Devin nodded. "Not just of the building, but of your personal security protocols. They had the elevator lock sequence ready, and they knew which cameras to disable to create blind spots from the penthouse to the street. You wouldn't have been seen until you were already outside, and by then, anyone watching would think you were leaving voluntarily." One of the analysts slid a tablet across the table. It displayed a series of building schematics with highlighted pathways in red. "These are the routes they cleared. If the alarm hadn't gone off, you would have been stuck on the top floor with the main elevators locked down. Security would have been locked out of camera access on those paths. They could have walked you into a service vehicle, and no one would have questioned it." The room was quiet for a moment, as the reality settled. Alexander could see it clearly now: the precision of the plan, the way every detail had been engineered to appear ordinary. It was the kind of move you only pulled off if you had people feeding you the right information from the inside. "Have you identified the breach point?" he asked. "Working on it," Devin replied. The device was piggybacking on a maintenance port that's usually only accessed by engineering staff. Whoever planted it either had credentials or had help from someone who did. "We're combing through keycard logs now." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had spent years building his company to be untouchable, his personal security layered like armor. Yet someone had managed to slip a knife between the plates. It wasn't random, it was calculated. As the team continued to work, he kept his focus on the evidence bag, on the small black device that had almost changed the course of his life. The fire alarm had stopped it. He still didn't know who had pulled it or why, but he knew this much: someone had just saved him from vanishing without a trace, and he intended to find out who, before the people behind this tried again. The footage played in grainy black and white on the large monitor at the end of the table. Alexander stood with his arms folded, leaning slightly forward, his eyes scanning every frame. The clip had been pulled from a hallway camera near the executive elevator, one of the few feeds still intact after the device's interference. Most of the angles they needed were gone, wiped out during the attempted lockdown, but this camera had survived. The image showed the quiet stretch of hallway moments before the alarm. A few employees passed through, talking in pairs or staring at their phones. Then, a small figure appeared at the far end. She wasn't rushing like the others. She moved with purpose, head turning slightly as if listening for something. Alexander stepped closer to the screen, narrowing his eyes. The girl couldn't have been more than 14. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she carried a backpack slung over one shoulder. In her other hand, she held a phone, the screen briefly lighting her face. She glanced toward the maintenance closet, hesitated for half a second, then disappeared from view. Devin paused the video, glancing at Alexander. "She's not on any employee list, and her face doesn't match any of the building's registered visitors for today. Play it again, Alexander said. The clip rewound, and this time he watched every movement, every flicker of expression. There was something about her eyes in that moment. Not fear exactly, but focus. She looked like someone making a choice she had already decided to live with, no matter the consequences. Then she was gone, slipping out of frame, and less than a minute later the alarm blared through the building. Find her, Alexander said quietly. Devon straightened. You think she's the one who pulled it? I think she's the reason I'm standing here instead of being driven off in a van right now, Alexander replied. That alarm didn't trip itself, and she was there at exactly the right time. He didn't say aloud what else he was thinking, that the set of her shoulders, the quick but deliberate way she moved, reminded him of people who had learned to make decisions on their own without waiting for someone to tell them it was the right thing to do. It was the kind of presence you didn't expect from someone her age. Devon nodded and began typing, pulling still images from the footage and sending them to the building's security network. Within minutes, photos of the girl were circulating to every guard and staff member on duty, along with instructions to check visitor logs, vendor records, and surveillance from the street outside. Alexander watched the frozen image of her on the screen. Her gaze caught mid-turn. Whoever she was, she had stepped into the middle of something dangerous without knowing the whole picture. And now he needed to find her, not just to thank her, but because if she had noticed something others missed, she might know more than either of them realized. Riley hadn't been back to the Grant Tower since the day of the fire alarm, and she hadn't planned to be. She had done her best to push the memory to the back of her mind, convincing herself that she had done the right thing and that staying quiet had been the safest choice. When a polite woman from building security called her mother saying they'd found a backpack that might belong to Riley, she hadn't questioned it much. She did own a plain black backpack, and maybe she'd left it behind without realizing. Still, something about the invitation to pick it up in person felt strange. She followed the security officer through the gleaming lobby, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the marble. Instead of being led to the lost and found desk, she was guided to a private elevator. The officer scanned a card, and the doors slid open without a sound. Riley stepped inside, clutching the strap of her real backpack, very much not lost, while the elevator began its smooth, silent climb. When the doors opened, she found herself in a reception area, unlike anything she'd seen before. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, and the air smelled faintly of leather and something crisp and clean. A tall woman in a fitted suit smiled briefly and motioned for her to follow. They walked down a short hallway until they reached a set of double-glass doors. Inside, Alexander Grant was waiting. He stood from behind a wide desk, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, the light from the windows catching in his hair. Riley froze for half a second. She had seen him before, that day in the elevator, but up close he seemed even taller, his presence filling the room in a way that made it impossible to look anywhere else. "Riley," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. "Thank you for coming." She stepped forward, unsure of where to stand, her gaze darting to the surface of his desk. There was no backpack. "We don't actually have anything of yours," Alexander continued, gesturing to a chair across from him. "I asked you here because I believe you saw something the day the fire alarm went off." Her mouth went dry. She thought about denying it, pretending she didn't know what he meant, but his eyes were steady, not accusing, just waiting. Slowly, she sat. "I saw something in a maintenance closet," she admitted. "A device. It was blinking. It didn't look like it belonged there." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped. "And you pulled the alarm?" Riley nodded once. "I thought it might be dangerous. I didn't know for sure." "You saved my life," he said simply. The words landed heavier than she expected. She wasn't sure what to say, so she just sat there, the hum of the city below filling the silence. For the first time since that day, she realized someone believed her without hesitation, and that made all the difference. Riley sat stiffly in the chair, her fingers twisting the strap of her backpack as Alexander waited. His attention didn't drift the way most adults did when she spoke. He didn't glance at his phone or tap his pen. He just watched her, steady and focused, as if every detail mattered. That alone made it easier to start talking. She told him about coming into the lobby that day and seeing the two men in suits by the elevators, how they weren't just standing there, they were watching. She described the way their eyes followed certain people, and how something about the way they looked at each other had stuck in her mind. She explained leaving to bring lunch to her mom, then catching that faint smell of burning wires in the hallway near the executive elevators. Alexander didn't move, but she could see the muscles in his jaw tighten slightly when she mentioned the smell. She went on, describing the maintenance closet and the small black device tucked between the cords and fire suppression controls, the steady blink of its red light, the way heat seemed to come off it even though it was small. She told him how she had taken pictures because it didn't look like it belonged there, and how she had hesitated before finally pulling the fire alarm. When she paused for breath, she glanced at him, expecting him to tell her she'd been reckless. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. "And after you pulled it?" he asked. She told him about blending into the crowd in the lobby, how she'd spotted the men again, this time on their phones, scanning the evacuees like they were looking for someone specific. She described how frustrated they'd looked, like whatever they'd been waiting for had been ruined. She admitted she'd slipped away before the police could question her, afraid she'd be blamed. Alexander sat in silence for a moment after she finished. The room felt still, almost heavy, as if the pieces she had handed him were clicking together in his mind. "That device," he said slowly, "was designed to lock down the top floors and cut power to specific security cameras. If the alarm hadn't gone off when it did, I would have been trapped in my office. Security wouldn't have been able to reach me in time, and there would have been no footage to show what happened." Her eyes widened. "They were going to take you?" He nodded once. "It was a coordinated attack. Kidnap me, steal the technology we were about to launch, and disappear before anyone knew. Your alarm stopped them before they could trigger the lockdown." Riley sat back, trying to process it. She had guessed it was bad, but she hadn't understood how close it had come. Alexander leaned forward now, his voice quieter but certain. "You didn't just see something strange, Riley. You stopped something that could have destroyed my company and maybe my life. You trusted your instincts, and you were right." For the first time since that day, she felt the tight knot of doubt in her chest loosen. Someone finally understood what she had done. The next time Riley came to the Grant Tower, it wasn't under the weight of nerves or with a made-up excuse about a lost backpack. Alexander had called her mother directly, speaking in the same calm, deliberate way he had with Riley, explaining that he wanted to thank them both properly. Her mom had been wary at first, unused to people with money showing interest in their lives, but the sincerity in his voice had been hard to doubt. They met in a quiet lounge on one of the upper floors, the windows spilling winter light across soft leather chairs. Riley sat beside her mother, feeling smaller than usual in the large space. Alexander arrived without an entourage, carrying a slim black case under his arm. He greeted her mother first, shaking her hand and thanking her for coming, before turning his attention to Riley. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did," he said, pulling a chair across from them. "And I don't believe a simple thank you is enough." Her mother's brow furrowed. "She didn't do it for a reward," she said quickly. "I know," Alexander replied, his tone gentle. "That's what makes it matter more." He opened the black case on the table between them. Inside was a sleek silver laptop, thinner and lighter than any Riley had ever seen. Its surface caught the light, her faint reflection bending in the metal. "This is custom built," Alexander explained. "It has my company's top security software installed, tools we don't release to the public. I thought it should go to someone who knows how to pay attention." Riley blinked, unsure how to respond. Her fingers itched to touch it, but she glanced at her mom first. "There's more," Alexander continued, sliding a small folder toward her mother. "I've arranged for a scholarship fund in Riley's name. It will cover her education through college, any program she chooses, so long as she wants it." Her mom stared at the folder like it might vanish. This is too much," she said, her voice catching. "It's exactly enough," Alexander said. "Your daughter noticed details that a building full of trained professionals missed. She acted when others froze. That's worth investing in." Riley felt her face warm, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper. Being seen, truly seen, for what she had done. She reached out and brushed her fingertips over the laptop's smooth edge. "Thank you," she said softly. Alexander smiled. "You've already proven you know how to use what you have. Now you'll have more to work with." They spent a few more minutes talking, but when Riley left the tower carrying the case under her arm, the weight of it felt less like a gift and more like a challenge. Someone believed in her enough to bet on her future. For a girl who had once wondered if she'd ever be more than a shadow in the corner of a room, that belief was worth more than anything money could buy. In the days that followed, Riley found herself back at the Grant Tower more than she ever expected. Sometimes it was for a quick meeting in Alexander's office. Sometimes it was just to drop off a signed paper for the scholarship arrangements. But each time she came, the nervousness that had once made her keep her head down faded a little more. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way the receptionists greeted her by name, the security guards giving her small nods of respect, even the engineers in the elevator offering her a smile. It was strange to feel like she belonged in a place she had once walked through as an invisible shadow. Alexander had a way of making her feel that way too. He never spoke to her like she was just a kid. When he asked questions, he waited for the answers. When she shared her thoughts, he listened as if her opinion might matter as much as his. It was a small thing, but it was something no other adult outside her mother had ever done. She started to understand that the calm she felt around him wasn't just about safety, it was about trust. For Alexander, the change was just as real. He'd built his life around careful planning, around keeping people at a distance where they couldn't distract him or hurt him. But Riley had walked straight past those walls without even trying. Every time he thought about the day of the fire alarm, the image of her in that hallway came back to him. Calm, focused, ready to act without hesitation. She had done what no security system or hired guard had managed to do. She had saved him. They began to talk about more than just that day. She would stop by his office after school, and they'd share coffee for him and hot chocolate for her. He'd tell her about the early years of his company, the mistakes he'd made and the risks he'd taken. She'd tell him about the neighborhood she grew up in, about the books she liked, about the way she had taught herself to spot patterns, because noticing small changes could sometimes mean the difference between safety and trouble. One afternoon, as they watched the city from his office windows, Alexander told her something he hadn't admitted to anyone else. "When you pulled that alarm, Riley, you didn't just stop them from taking me," he said quietly. "You stopped them from taking everything I've built. Without you, I'd have nothing left." She looked at him, surprised by the seriousness in his voice. "And without you," she said, "I wouldn't have anyone who believed me the first time I said something." It was an odd friendship between a guarded millionaire and a 14-year-old girl who had learned to watch the world with sharp eyes. But it fit. They didn't need to explain it to anyone. He saw her as the reason he was still here, and she saw him as the first adult who had ever truly listened. And for both of them, that was enough. Winter had turned to spring. By the time the news broke, the names of the people behind the attempted kidnapping and data theft scrolled across the bottom of the television in Alexander's office, their mugshots flashing one after another. The two suited men from the lobby had been picked up in another city, caught trying to run a similar scheme on a finance executive. Investigators tied them to a wider network, and with enough evidence gathered, the arrests came quickly. It was over in the official sense. the case moving from whispered theory to undeniable fact. Riley didn't hear about it from the news first. She heard it from Alexander. He called her mother that morning and asked if they could come by the tower. When Riley stepped into his office, he was standing by the window, the sunlight catching the edges of the city skyline behind him. On his desk was a folder, thick with papers, and beside it, a familiar black and white still image from the hallway security camera, the one where she had been caught mid-turn, seconds before she disappeared from the frame. "They've been arrested," he said, turning toward her with a small smile. "All of them. The men in the lobby, the ones who planted the device, and the people who hired them. It's finished." Riley let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So they can't try again?" "They won't," Alexander assured her. "Not on me. Not on anyone else. The FBI has enough on them to keep them locked away for a long time." She nodded, her eyes drifting to the photo on his desk. It was strange to think that a single moment caught on camera could hold so much weight. "I know you've tried to stay out of the spotlight," Alexander said, his voice softer now. "But I need you to understand something. You didn't just pull an alarm that day. You changed the course of my life." Riley shifted, not sure how to answer. "If you hadn't acted when you did, I wouldn't be here. My company wouldn't be here. Everything I've built could have been stolen, and I might not have been able to stop it. You gave me more than time. You gave me a chance to fight back, and I will never forget that." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw he meant it. Not in the way people said thank you out of politeness, but in the way that came from something permanent. "I didn't do it to be a hero," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "That's what makes you one." They talked a little longer, but when she left his office that day, the air outside felt different, lighter somehow. The city moved on as if nothing had happened, but Riley knew better. She didn't need the world to know her name or her story. It was enough that the one person who mattered understood exactly what she had done. And deep down, she understood it too. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.